I'm presenting this paper from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I also pay my respects to the elders of Indigenous countries in which you are situated. This paper reflects on a current creative research project that I'm building. It's called Animals in Emergency, and it's a creative nonfiction podcast dedicated to the forgotten or ignored stories of multi-species communities impacted by eco-catastrophe and environmental crime. The project brings a literary multi-species perspective to oral history and audio documentary. It's about stories, language, justice for animals and ecologies at a time when, as Deborah Bird Rose has written, animals are living in excruciatingly dynamic deathscapes, positioned in zones of increasing conflict and terror. This project is also about listening for stories in those places where people might say there are no stories, only animals. In this way, it seeks to cultivate storytelling practices that push against language, philosophies, presumptions, and writing methodologies that rest on and reify extractive logics in relation to more than human lives and deaths. This project has emerged in response to the 2019-2020 bushfires in Australia, particularly responding to the way public media has or has not spoken about multi-beings during the catastrophe or since. Media response has been commented on by a few critical animal studies scholars and advocates, including political scientist Siobhan O'Sullivan, who has called for a much needed national conversation about the responsibilities we all have for more than human beings at a time of intensifying climate catastrophe. Journalist Anna Mikovits has pointed out the role stories play in bringing on these conversations when she says, "The bushfire crisis has also revealed our arbitrary relationships to animals based on the stories we tell about them. While we individually place food and water in our yards for displaced wildlife, injured cows are tracked to the slaughterhouse." As many people will know, the ecologist Professor Chris Dickman provided the estimate of animal death for last summer's fires at a radically conservative 1.25 billion. This figure was based on a 2007 report for the Worldwide Fund for Nature that was focused on the effects of land clearing on Australian wildlife in New South Wales. And as Professor Dickman has acknowledged, those 2007 figures were already conservative. Of these fires, environmental historian Tom Griffiths has written, "We are the burning frontier of a warming world, the perilous cliff edge of the sixth extinction. This may be the first fire season that Australians have tried to calculate the mortality of wildlife." 1.25 billion is a shocking figure, but it's perhaps even more distressing for the fact that it does not include the mortality of bats, insects, invertebrates, frogs, or those animals constituted as livestock. Nor does it account for the mass fish kills that occurred in the wake of the fires as ash poured into rivers and streams when rains came. And this is particularly the case in the Macleay River in northern New South Wales, where residents described that the water turned to a cake mix type consistency. On the 7th of January 2020, market analyst Mercado estimated that around 8.6 million sheep and 2.3 million cows were under threat of fire in the states of New South Wales and Victoria alone. The Mercado figures were derived from NASA mapping data, which was then cross-referenced with Meat and Livestock Australia data of sheep and cattle distribution made in June 2018. Despite the release of these figures, the Federal Agricultural Minister, Bridget McKenzie, publicly estimated 100,000 farm animals might have perished. This figure has not yet been publicly revised, despite the fact that over 50,000 sheep were shot on Kangaroo Island off South Australia alone following the fires. So already there is an enormous discrepancy in the public story of animal death and what has actually happened as a result of the 2019-2020 fires. News coverage of animal deaths, particularly relating to livestock, during the first few days of this new decade, codified the mass suffering of farmed animals in the following ways: as a logistical challenge, deficit to the national herd, biosecurity risk, mass burials and the lifting of landfill levies, and mass shooting events. I don't doubt that any of these are true and extremely important, but they're not the whole story. I was living in St Kilda at the time of the fires, doing what many people in the city were doing. I was sitting online most of the day and at night when I couldn't sleep, reading as much as I could about the fires. I was reading news article after news article about animals and found that many, particularly when writing about farmed animals, had produced truncated narratives by using images of deceased animals and pull quotes like this one. They just cook inside and explode, but said little else about the lives and deaths of the animals they were talking about. The idea of truncated narratives comes from critical ecological feminist Marty Keel. The term describes stories that erase important details that might have provided insight into how a dilemma has come to exist in the first place. For Keel, the term describes a heroic mode of doing ethics and storytelling, one that searches for solutions to problems such as mass shootings and mass burials, without taking into view the kinds of systems, structures, or relations that have produced these dilemmas in the first place. Where Keel links this practice to heroic modes of thinking, I link it to extractive modes of thinking and writing. And that extractive practice, to my mind, is exemplified by the key points sections of such news articles. And while I don't doubt that a key points section has use, it flattens the magnitude of suffering to that of statistics. For me, what is exemplified in these extracts is writing and reporting practice that draws on an extractive logic that commodifies the vision of animal death. And I've purposefully not used an image of deceased animals on this slide because I don't want to perpetuate the very argument that I'm unraveling. So, in an article called Perverse Visibilities, Foregrounding Non-Human Animals in Ethical and Sustainable Meat Production, animal studies scholar Paula Arcari has critically explored the way that visions of animal death can be foregrounded for ostensibly ethical reasons, but nonetheless can result in the normalization of commodifying and selling visions of animal death. In the case of meat production, as Arcari explores, it's not just the bodies of the animals that are literally up for sale. The vision of their deaths is also something that can be consumed. And I see a resonance with Arcari's argument in her research and the complex double bind present in the pull quotes and images of blackened and bloated animal bodies that pepper the articles about last summer's fires. Despite registering the content of the images as distressing at the top of the articles, the images accompany reports that make no effort to really significantly engage with what happened to these specific animals before, during, or after the fires, but they rather address animal death through the lens of the suffering of farmers. I'm not suggesting to ignore or sideline the experience of suffering farmers. I'm suggesting that extractive writing practices fail to be able to address both animal-human sufferings at the same time, and writing practices capable of doing both are urgently needed. For the moment, I provisionally define extractive writing practices as those that focus on animal narratives through numbers, units of value, and other banal chronicles that strip animals of the possibility of having their biography and even their thanatography recorded or marked for history. The term thanatography describes a specific writing of death, and even writing from death in a literary culture that addresses the issue of survival. This provisional definition of extractive writing leads me to ask certain questions that are driving the production of the podcast project. These questions are: how to rewrite the stories of animal death so that they become more than numbers, fragments, units of value, and other banal chronicles that strip the dead of their animality and agency. How to write a collective biography or thanatography of these deceased subjects, and could such a writing practice resurrect their lives from the ruins of disaster? These questions will remain unanswered in this paper. I'm drawing on the thinking of cultural historian Sadia Hartman here when I ask, could such work begin to trace the lineaments of new narratives? And could they act as a counter chronicle of more than human animals in a world increasingly overrun with omnicidal tendencies, driven by a mania for extractive logics, lifestyles, and practices? Anti-extractive storytelling practice might be one that furiously and uncompromisingly asks, as has Robin McKay in her foreword to Jason Barback-Mulgahey's edited book, Omnicide, Mania, Fatality, and the Future in Delirium, what could incite such mania to flare up into the lethal conviction that everything must be annihilated? The same question could and must be asked of storytelling practices that do not question, but merely report on the conviction that everything must be annihilated. To bring this paper to its conclusion, I want to cycle back to Tom Griffiths, who in the Australian Book Review has asked, whatever we call this summer, will we make it a season of reckoning? And I'm driven back to the etymology of the word reckoning as a narrative account. And that drives me back to the idea of the importance of writers cultivating anti-extractive modes of storytelling. Now, I'll finish with an example of a piece of writing that, for me, offers up strategies that push against the extractive logic that led to the killings it documents in the first place. This piece of writing is a poem by First Nations writer Ali Cobby Eckermann. It's called It's Just So Wrong, Respect to Gunai Kurnai. This poem is part of Eckermann's poetic cycle called The Extinction of Kindness that was commissioned by the Red Room Poetry Extinction Elegies Project. This poem responds to a case that's a different form of animals in emergency. And in this instance, the poem documents the case where a farm worker, Murray James Sylvester, was found guilty of poisoning 420 wedge-tailed eagles over an 18-month period across 3 properties in Gippsland, Gunai Kurnai country, here in the state of Victoria, Australia. Sylvester injected the poison lanate, which is just one of the trade names for a broad spectrum insecticide, methamil, into the necks of lambs who were then fed on by the eagles. Also colloquially known as magic, because if undiluted, it will kill anything. Lanate is a class of chemical called carbamates, which work by inhibiting an essential enzyme for proper functioning of the nervous system. The substance is so toxic that the eagles poisoned by Sylvester died within 30 minutes of consuming it. Their bodies were then stashed across the 3 properties, across a total of 2,000 hectares. As many people will know, wedge-tailed eagles are the manifestation of the creator spirit, Bunjil. They're also a species protected by the Wildlife Act 1975, which is mentioned numerous times across the news media representations of this case, whereas the cultural significance of the wedge-tailed eagle to First Peoples is often left out. What strikes me about the way Eckermann has engaged with this subject is that she places a poem speaker with other mourners outside the courthouse where they sing and weep for the loss of their kin. And part of what she does here is refusing to write with the seemingly omnipotent eye of the courtroom journalist. Rather, she grounds the poem in the perspective of those who are animated by relations of significance with wedge-tailed eagles. Eckermann's account, in my mind, is anti-extractivist because it does this perspective work, but also because it doesn't prioritize an anthropocentric perspective, even as the poem speaks to the structures and systems such as colonization and extractive agriculture that have led to the catastrophe. So now I'm going to play the poem for you.
Way, my name's Ali Cobby Eckermann, and this is my poem, It's Just So Wrong. It's wrong to kill an eagle, the old man said, sitting in the dark, staring up at the sky. the embers of the campfire away with the wind. That badness gets stuck inside wrong ways. And I thought about that statement for a while, about how self-justification can be a crime, about how every farm is a fiefdom, about how every paddock diverts the natural, about how the need for capital can vile a moral mind. That badness gets stuck inside wrong ways. And we see it now in the newspapers, and we feel it now in the absence in the sky. It's wrong to kill an eagle, the old man said, staring up at the sky through his tears, orbs of spirit shining where eagles once flew. We sit outside the courthouse to sing our songs. We sing for the justice that is unjustifiable. We cry when the verdict is given. We sit outside the jailhouse to sing our songs. We sing for the massacres that litter our lands. We sit crying with feathers in our hair.
Thank you very much for listening.